All right, so now we want to start seeing how this model explains to us what's going on within our economy. So we're going to talk about kind of three different scenarios of what might be happening within our economy as it relates to our equilibriums. So first and foremost, we want to say what happens if we're operating at our potential, or what we might say is operating at our long run equilibrium. Remember, that means that we have our aggregate demand curve intersecting with our short run aggregate supply curve, and that intersection is also taking place at a point with our long run aggregate supply curve. So what this means is that this is our maximum sustainable output in the long run. We're using all of our resources efficiently. Now, what does it say about some of those other indicators? Well, since we're using all of our resources efficiently, what we see is that our unemployment is at its natural rate, right? Because we said when we're at our natural rate, that's always like kind of the normal level of unemployment we're going to have. But what that really just means is there's no cyclical unemployment, right? And so we don't have any of that bad kind of unemployment that exists. That's not there. We also say that the economy is producing at a real GDP that's equal to its potential. Potential GDP is actually a thing. It's something that you could go and look up, and the United States actually has it mapped out for what they estimate for the next 20 years of what their potential GDP is, that if we continue at our growth in terms of resources and technology, what our levels of output could be, what is our potential there. And this is our goal. Our goal is to be operating at a point currently, right? Short run aggregate supply intersects with aggregate demand. We want to be at a point currently that is also equal to our potential. It's equal to us being sustainable. This is where we want our economy to be. But that's not always the case. So what happens maybe in a scenario where we are operating at a point that we would say is below our potential? So let's say we have our long run aggregate supply. Remember, that represents our potential. But we have our aggregate demand and our short run aggregate supply. Now, if you notice here, our short run aggregate supply and our aggregate demand curve are intersecting at a point to the left of our potential, which means we are below our potential output. Anything that's on this left side of our long run aggregate supply curve represents us being below our potential, because that short run intersection, the where we are right now, is at a GDP or an output that is lower than our potential. So if you notice, YE, so our output at our equilibrium, is lower than our YP, our output at our potential. What this means is we are not using our resources efficiently, right? We're underachieving as an economy. The green line, us being at the green line, represents us using all of our resources as well as we can. But right now we're not. And since we're not using our resources efficiently, we're not creating an output that is equal to what we could be doing. We see this means that our unemployment is above the natural rate. And so what this ends up meaning is that because it's above the natural rate, we end up seeing that we have cyclical unemployment. Some of that bad type of unemployment exists. We say that our output is below its potential. This means we're in a recession. And that should make sense to you. Whenever we're in a recession, we have more unemployment. We have some of that bad unemployment. And this space that exists between where we're currently operating, our YE, and where we could be operating, our YP, that's known as a recessionary gap, or sometimes also a contractionary gap. The gap that exists between where we are and where we could be. And so this right here represents our economy being in a recession. Now, what about the other side of things? What would happen maybe if we're at a point where we have our green line here, but we have our aggregate demand and our short run aggregate supply, and it is at a point beyond the green line, or we're operating above our potential? Now, some of you might look at this and you're like, hold on a second, Bradley, I thought you said that green line was us operating at a point that was that's our production possibilities curve, and we know we can't be beyond our production possibilities curve. How are we beyond our potential? How are we overly efficient? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But any point beyond here, we say that we're above our potential. Our short run aggregate supply curve intersection is to the right of our long run aggregate supply. What we end up seeing is that we're at a point here where our prices are higher than normal. We're actually experiencing something we call inflationary pressure. And we see that prices are rising faster. Unemployment is actually below the natural rate. We're maybe in the threes or down into the twos. We see output is above its potential. And you're like, how in the world can that be? Well, let me explain it to you this way. Suppose that you are running a marathon. Now, there is some pace that you could run that marathon at that is sustainable for you. Like that for the entire 26 miles, you could run at that same pace. Well, that's what our green line represents. We said the green line represents us being sustainable. It means that, hey, if we're as efficient as possible, this is our maximum, right? In the same way you're running a marathon, if you're as efficient as possible, there's some best time that you can go. Now, is it possible for you to walk up to the start line and they say go and you take off at a dead sprint? Well, yeah, that's absolutely possible. But can you do that for 26 miles? No. What's going to end up happening is you're going to have some issues, right? Like you're going faster than you should and things are looking really good for a short amount of time, but it's not sustainable. And you're going to end up paying for it over time. You're going to pay for it in the long run unless you slow things down, unless you say, hey, I need to rein it in and get back to my sustainable pace. Maybe another example to think about. Have you guys ever had those weeks at school where it's just like you're like getting 2 hours of sleep every single night? Maybe you're pulling an all-nighter, studying, doing homework. It's like, okay, you could sustain that for like a day or two, right? You could maybe pull an all-nighter and then 2 hours of sleep the next night. You could sustain that for a little bit, but is that sustainable in the long run? Is it sustainable for you to pull an all-nighter every night? Is it sustainable for you to only get an hour of sleep and do 12 hours of studying a day? No, that's not sustainable. And so what we see is that if you want your life, if you want to feel good, like you're going to try to be at that sustainable rate. Can you go above it for a little bit? Yeah, but only for a short period of time. If you stay there too long, it's going to have long-term consequences. We're saying the same thing with our economy here. And we see that if we have a situation like this, when we're beyond our potential, we call this an expansionary gap. Our economy has expanded beyond its potential. But again, like we said, we can only stay there for a little bit.